Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Unitarian Church here in Fall River, Massachusetts. As we are here today to listen to the Reverend Richard Trudeau. Thank you all.
Welcome to the Unitarian Church in Fall River, where we think religious questions are important, but we want to work out our own answers, where we gather to share ideas and support one another. We gather this hour as people of faith, having sorrows and joys and needs and gifts. We like to speak of hope as a sign of our quest for truth and meaning, and in celebration of the life we share together. Can we please join in our opening hymn number 207, Earth Was Given as a Garden. Please stay standing and join in unison affirmation in the order of service. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. I'm going to pass around what looks like an Indian arrowhead, and I'm going to pass it in a box. I'm hoping that when you pass it from one to another, that you put it in the box. Donald's going to hold it up in front of the camera for a second. It's really not an arrowhead, it's a knife. Think of a round branch about 6 or 7 inches long, and in one end of it, imagine a slot was cut, and then this was put in the slot and then lashed to the end with some kind of animal gut probably, or a leather thong, and it was a knife. This is how Native Americans okay. The reason it's in the box is I'm hoping when we pass it from one another, we don't drop it on the floor. Okay, so, but once you get the box, feel free to open it and take it out and look at it and everything. But then when you pass it to the next person, please put it back in the box. Imagine when you get that, imagine that thing. Imagine that's what you needed to do to cut leather, to cut meat, to cut raw vegetables. Just think about that. It's a knife. It's a knife. It's about 1,000 years old, they say. I got it when I was a kid. A friend of my mother had a husband who had found it while gardening, had dug it up in his garden. Somewhere in New England, I don't know where, because this guy who dug it up was a Methodist minister who was moving all over New England, and I don't know where it was he dug it up. Today I'm going to talk about 5 ancestors of mine who lived in the 1600s, who were born in the 1600s, who had some involvement with Indians. And I was telling a friend of mine about this. This is a friend from high school. And she said, "Oh, your family's much more interesting than mine." And I said, "Well, no. We all have, in the 1600s, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of direct ancestors. That is, people who are many times great-grandfathers or many times great-grandmothers. We have hundreds of them. And among hundreds of people, there are some to which interesting things happened, or they did interesting things." And I said to my friend, "No, the difference between you and me, I'm lucky in 2 ways. Number one, most of my ancestors who were alive in the 1600s were already on this side of the Atlantic, where the records are better and genealogy is easier to do. Plus, I didn't have to do much work because there was someone distantly related to my mother who in 1950 did her genealogy. His hobby was genealogy. He was an elementary school teacher, but his hobby was genealogy. And now I'm married to someone who in her retirement has become a professional genealogist, and so she did the genealogy on my father's side. So no, my family's not more interesting, I'm just lucky." For announcements, there's a potluck next week. Think of bringing something to share, but if you come without something to share, feel free to stay and partake of what we've managed to scrounge up anyway. And if you're visiting today, please sign our guest book. Please give us your email address. We promise we will not be like CVS and send you an email every day for the rest of your life. We'll just send you an email once in a while, telling you what's happening. Are there other announcements?
And now, welcome back, Keys.
However, good morning, everyone. I so missed you for the last few weeks when I was away. I really am so excited. Saying at home yesterday, I'm so excited to go to church tomorrow. Thank you for being here and for taking care of everything that I usually try to take care of, Eric. And thank you, Richard, for this very interesting topic. This one I'm sure to be very.
We'll see. You know.
I think it'll be, well, I think you're very right remarks to your mind. And please, know that Richard Peaks will be back again next week. And his topic is going to be calm if you something. Yeah, calm if you have doubts. So,
I've seen it couple.
yeah. So please come and make it feel welcome. Thank you.
Anybody else announcement?
We're,
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
yes.
I don't know what kind of announcement this, but this gentleman at the church we used to go to in Somerset, Congregational Church, his name was Warren Paul, G-O-F-F. He used to collect those. And in Somerset, yeah, he had hundreds and hundreds. If you go to the Somerset Museum, you can see tons of them. He had a few dipped in gold, his wife there. And I used to collect them because I lived on the Indian Trail from the Taunton River that went to like Break Point, that little prospect. And the Indians used to just shoot everything over there, so I would just make a little dive in the back and get 5 in a minute.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, Jerry.
Wow.
And we did find out about some information on the laundry law here in Fall River, helping the homeless with their laundry services twice a month on Wednesday. If you want to look it up, you can just look up laundry law. They're looking for donations to help continue with their services because it's a free service for the homeless to get their laundry done when they need to. And that'll be going on second Wednesday and the third Wednesday of the month. You can check.
Last Wednesday.
The last Wednesday of the month, last Wednesday and the third? Second and last, whichever day it comes on, how many days of the month it comes. Yeah, it's called laundry law.
Thank you. Did everybody get a chance to look at this? Could we please be joined in a spirit of prayer or meditation? Of course, I have to do a prayer composed by Indians. This, of course, this is not in the 1600s. This is by a Lakota Sioux medicine man named Chief Yellow Lark. This was written in 1887, but I love this. This pretty much covers it as far as prayer is concerned, as far as I'm concerned. O Great Spirit, whose voice I hear in the winds, and whose breath gives life to all the world, hear me. I am small and weak. I need your strength and wisdom. Let me walk in beauty and make my eyes ever behold the red and purple sunset. Make my hands respect the things you have made and my ears sharp to hear your voice. Make me wise so that I may understand the things you have taught my people. Let me learn the lessons you have hidden in every leaf and rock. I seek strength, not to be greater than my brother and sister, but to fight my greatest enemy, myself. Make me always ready to come to you with clean hands and straight eyes. So, when life fades, as the fading sunset, my spirit may come to you without shame. Amen. And now let us be silent together to create an opportunity for prayer or meditation. John Tisdale was one of the 26 original property owners of Old Freetown, which doesn't include East Freetown, but includes the rest of Freetown and Fall River north of the Quikasham River. So here, north of Government Center, 26 settlers bought from the Indians Old Freetown in 1659. And John Tisdale had parcel number 23, which was in a sonnet. One part of his farm included Profile Rock, which, as you may know, collapsed about 4 or 5 years ago. There's nothing to see there. It was never very exciting, but there's nothing to see there. Anyway, that was on his property, and his property went all the way down to the Assonet River. He was born in England, and he married Sarah Walker, who was also born in England, but they met and married here. And one of their children they named John Tisdale. So this second John Tisdale married Anna Rogers. And one of their children was John Tisdale. And this third John Tisdale married Abigail Birch. And one of their children was Anna Tisdale, who married Abiel Dean. And one of their children, Samuel Dean, married Hannah, whose last name I have not been able to find, and this drives me nuts. But Samuel Dean and Hannah had among their children Hepzibah Dean, who married Darius Daggett. And one of their children was Hepzibah Daggett, who married Culliver Vesey. And one of their children was Eunice Vesey, who married William Aiken. One of their children was Frances Aiken, who married Durbin Selly. That's Frances, that's a female Frances. And Durbin, that's I guess a man's name. Frances Aiken married Durbin Selly. Their daughter, Luva Selly, Luva, married William Sprague. Their daughter, Marjorie Sprague, married Chester Bell, and their daughter, Dorothy Bell, was my mother.
The music today is all music that you might have heard in this area if you happen to be an early settler. But this one in particular that I'm going to play right now, there's a little description. It says the Moravians brought with them to America a great tradition of music. They used it in worship, at work, and at play. Each day, a time was set aside for communal singing. And services called love feasts, which Richard would like to adopt here, were held on Saturdays and on special occasions. It's said that at a love feast that was held on September 14, 1745, the German hymn Duce Jubilo was sung simultaneously and spontaneously in 13 languages, including Bohemian, Dutch, English, French, German, Irish, Mohawk, Mohegan, Swedish, Welsh, and Wendish. And just also I'll mention this picture up here is my great grandmother on my father's side, who was, according to family legend, a Cree Indian who came down from Canada. So if you feel like a love piece, this is the time.
Growing up, what I knew about Indians was Tonto. I liked Tonto. But I had heard that Indians hadn't been very well treated, and I remember this was brought home spectacularly to me, probably when I was about the 8th grade, and I found a book in the library in the young people section called The Trail of Tears in the Andrew Jackson administration in the 1830s. 4 or 5 Indian tribes were removed from the southeastern United States and marched to basically Oklahoma. One tribe after another. The last was the Cherokee in 1838. And this book was about the removal of the Cherokee. And they were forced by soldiers to walk to Oklahoma. This took weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and many people died, and it was terrible suffering. When they wound up in Oklahoma, they were resented by the 3 or 4 tribes that were already there. Here's more mouths to feed, more people to find land for. It was really heartbreaking. And of course, ever since, we hear a lot about this. Indian land was stolen, the treaties were broken, Thanksgiving Day ought to be a day of mourning, and so on. I want to tell you about 3 ancestors on my mother's side, 2 on my father's side. The 3 on my mother's side were all involved one way or another with King Philip's War. Just to make sure everyone understands that King Philip was an Indian, okay? Massasoit, whose name was really Uzzah Miquin, but Massasoit, the grand sachem of the Wampanoags, who welcomed the Indians, he had that role for about 40 years. He died in 1661. And he was succeeded very briefly by his oldest son, Wamsuda, whose Christian name was Alexander, but who died just the following year of natural causes. And then Wamsuda was succeeded by Metacom, whose Christian name was Philip. And he was called King Philip because in those days, the settlers tended not to use the word chief for an Indian leader or the word sachem, but instead called the Indian leaders kings. So he was King Philip, but he was an Indian. King Philip's War lasted down here 2 years, 1675, 1676. It lasted till 1678 up in Maine. It was, they say, well, by one standard, the worst war to take place on the soil of what became the United States. The worst in terms of the percentage of the population killed. If you took all of the Indians and all of the settlers together, 10% of those people died. And by contrast, in World War II, something like 1/3 of 1% of Americans died in World War II. So King Philip's War, in terms of the percentage of people who died, was 30 times as devastating on our country as World War II. Massasoit had sought an alliance with the settlers early on. One reason was defense. The population of the Wampanoags had been cut way down because of European diseases. The Indians had been relating to European people long before Plymouth. Europeans were coming and fishing off the coast here. And so there was a lot of interaction between, and the Indians had been living isolated from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years. And so their immune systems couldn't cope with a lot of diseases that these visitors brought. And if you take a disease like smallpox, which would have killed maybe 25% of the people in a settler village, well, smallpox would kill 80% of the people in an Indian village. And so when the settlers landed in Plymouth, it was abandoned. Plymouth was Patuxet. It was an Indian village that had been abandoned because of these epidemics. Massasoit sought an alliance with the settlers because, first of all, his people had been greatly depopulated, and he was worried about the Narragansett just to the west, who were kind of his traditional, I don't know about enemies, but there was a lot of tension between them. So he wanted a military alliance with these settlers. And also he wanted to trade with the settlers. The settlers had wonderful things that the Indians much desired. And I can't think of a more eloquent way of understanding this than to think of trying to use that knife. Imagine using that to cut leather, cut meat, cut raw vegetables. Imagine using that. And the Indians saw these settlers had steel knives and axes and hatchets and steel hoes for cultivating the soil and metal kettles to cook in. These things were wonderful. The Indians were living in the Stone Age. And the settlers had these wonderful things. Massasoit wanted to trade with the settlers. And early on, there was a nice arrangement because in Europe, there was this fashion craze for beaver hats, for hats made out of beaver felt. And so the Indians would collect beaver pelts and trade them to the settlers for things like knives and hoes and so on. And then the settlers could sell them at a profit in Europe. But then two things happened. First of all, the beaver supply tended to be diminished, though the Indians could trade with other Indians further west. But also the fashions in Europe changed. Suddenly beaver pelts weren't worth anything anymore. And so the settlers weren't willing to trade for beaver pelts anymore. But by then the Indians, the rank and file Indians were pressing the leaders to continue to trade for these European goods, because these European goods were in such demand. And the only thing the settlers wanted after a while was land. That's all the Indians could sell to get these goods. By the way, in that 1659 treaty that purchased old Freetown from the Wampanoags, this was the price. This was what all that land was sold for. 20 coats, European coats, thick woolen coats woven on looms, 2 rugs, big carpets, I think, 2 iron pots, 2 kettles, and 1 little kettle, 8 pair of shoes, much more durable than what the Indians had on their feet, 6 pair of stockings, 1 dozen hoes for cultivating the soil, 1 dozen hatchets, 2 pieces of broadcloth. And I think that's really bolts of broadcloth. That was the price. Excuse me. The sale was overseen by the government of Plymouth. All of these Indian sales were overseen by the government of Plymouth, because early on, there had been a sort of chaos. An Indian would sell a piece of land to a settler and then sell the same piece of land to another settler. But the Indians were getting cheated too, when settlers who had no right to start farming a piece of land would just sort of take it over without ever having paid anybody anything for it. So the government in Plymouth oversaw all of the sales. The sale of Old Freetown was approved by Massasoit, who was still alive. He did not sign the deed because he wasn't very well. He was going to die in a year or so. But the deed was signed by Wamsuta, who was going to be his successor, and by Weetamoo, who was the female. Weetamoo was married to Wamsuta. Weetamoo was the leader of the Pocasets, who were here, I think, like from the Quikasham River south and into Rhode Island. They signed it. The land certainly was not stolen from them. They were not forced to sell. In fact, the deed itself indicates they weren't forced to sell, because there's a big chunk that the Indians excluded from the sale, a chunk that some Indians had started to farm using European techniques. And they said, oh, no, we're not going to include that. So early on, people say there was a great misunderstanding between the settlers and the Indians over the concept of land ownership. And there may well have been, because the Europeans meant, this land is mine, you stay off. That the Indians didn't have that concept of land ownership. But Massasoit was not a stupid man, and he kept selling land for 40 years, right? If there was a misunderstanding early on, by the time this sale took place, the Indians well understood the European concept of land ownership. King Philip's War seems to have arisen. I mean, there were all kinds of reasons. There was all kinds of disrespect and little squabbles in all kinds of areas on both sides. But the basic reason seems to be that the younger Indians were feeling really squeezed out. Thousands of immigrants were coming from Europe every year. And it wasn't long before the Indians were greatly outnumbered, and that so much of their land had been sold to the settlers. The younger Indians in particular were feeling really squeezed out, and they were agitating. And In June of 1675, two of these, without Philip's approval, Philip was in charge. When Philip took over in 1662, he was only 24. But by the time of the outbreak of the war, he was 13 years older, so what, 37? Never seemed to have commanded the respect that his father did, never seemed to have had the amount of control over his people that his father did. Well, anyway, two braves burned two farms in Swansea. They burned down the houses, they burned down the barns. They didn't kill anybody, but that was it. The war was on. And they had done this without Philip's permission or knowledge. But the war was on. John Tisdale was one of the first to be killed. He was killed within a week. His children were grown and I think had moved away. When he heard about these tensions with the Indians, he sent his wife away for safety. But he was guarding the farmstead up in Assonet, and Indians came and killed him and burned down his house and burned down his barn. I want to tell you about two more of my mother's ancestors, much more briefly. Captain John Gallup was the settlers, of course, formed an army right away. And by the settlers, I mean the United Colonies, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Plymouth, not Rhode Island. And Captain John Gallup was many times great-grandfather of mine. John Tisdale was my 10th great-grandfather. And Captain John Gallup was something like that, 8 or 9 or 10, about that. He was a captain in the settler army. And in December of the first year of the war, 1675, he participated in a surprise attack on a fortified Narragansett village in South Kingstown, Rhode Island, in the middle of a big swamp. This battle was remembered by the settlers as the Great Swamp Fight. But what it was an unannounced attack on a Narragansett village in which hundreds of Indians were killed, including lots of women and children and old men. The Narragansett had not yet joined the Wampanoags in hostilities. So, of course, as you might imagine, they did immediately after this. And only 20 or 30 of the settler army were killed. It was a shameful thing, the Great Swamp Fight. It was a shameful thing. But Captain John Gallup did have the good grace to be among those who were killed. So that's something. And then the third ancestor I want to tell you about on my mother's side is James Keith. He was the first minister in Bridgewater. And this was the parsonage in Bridgewater. Bridgewater then was a much bigger town, including the present day Bridgewaters, but also Brockton and part of Abington, part of Whitman. And he was the first minister, and this was the parsonage. He and his wife, Susanna Edson, lived here. It's still standing. You can go see it. It's on River Street in West Bridgewater. The original center of the old Bridgewater was what is now West Bridgewater. In late 1676, when the war was about over here, Philip had been killed in August of 1676. Weedamoo was dead. She wasn't killed, she drowned trying to get across the Taunton River. She was dead. A lot of Philip's generals were dead. A son of Philip, a 10-year-old boy, had been captured by the settler army. And the question was, what should we do with this kid? And the governments of Massachusetts and Plymouth got together and consulted with 4 or 5 ministers. And there were 2 choices. We either kill the kid or we sell him to slavery in the Caribbean. A lot of the captured Indians were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. That was it. and they were consulting the ministers. What should we do? And all the ministers except James Keith. James Keith was my 8th great-grandfather, and Susanna Edson, his wife, my 8th great-grandmother. All but James Keith said, kill the kid, and found some Bible verse that supported that. And James Keith found another Bible verse and said, no, you have to let him live. Which meant, of course, the kid was going to be sold into slavery in the Caribbean. But it was now late 1676. It was winter. No ships were going to the Caribbean. So James Keith and Susanna Edson said, we will shelter the boy for the winter in our house. So Philip's son spent the winter of 1676, 1677 in this house, in this building still standing. It's one of the very few buildings in existence with any connection to King Philip's War that's still standing. And when spring came and the ships were heading to, moving around again, the boy was nowhere to be found. And that's as far as historians know for sure. But there are very persistent rumors that James Keith and Susanna Edson smuggled the kid to Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyard then belonged to New York. New York was not involved in King Philip's War. So if that's true, King Philip may have descendants today, alive somewhere. If not on Martha's Vineyard, then maybe somewhere else. I don't think he would have stayed in Martha's Vineyard. It's too close. But anyway, I want to tell you about two ancestors of mine on my father's side. One was Elizabeth Corse, C-O-R-S-E. She was born in 1696. When she was 8, what's called the Deerfield Massacre took place. Deerfield, Massachusetts was then on the frontier, right? It's on the Connecticut River, on the frontier of English settlement. Up in Canada, the French settlers and the Indians were getting along much better and had really formed a military alliance. And France and England were almost perpetually at war at this time. And there was a war going on in 1704. And so a large troop of Indians with a few French military people came down and raided Deerfield. And this was seen to be a contribution to the war between England and France. And a lot of people were killed, and more than 100 people were marched back to Canada. It happened, by the way, on February 29th, which we just observed back on Thursday. It was 320 years ago, last Thursday, that this all happened. 100 people were marched to Canada in March, in the winter still. It was 300 miles. It took weeks and weeks. Mostly they were walking on frozen rivers. And as you might expect, lots of people didn't make it. Elizabeth Corse's mother, whose name was Elizabeth Catlin, didn't make it. She died on the way. Elizabeth's father had died soon after she was born, so he wasn't involved with this at all. Elizabeth herself was 8 in 1704 and made it all the way to Canada, and she was placed with a French-Canadian family. Some of the captives were placed with, some of the children anyway, were placed with French-Canadian families. Some were placed with Indian families. And they tended to grow up as either French-Canadians or Indians. And she grew up to be a French-Canadian. She was baptized a Catholic. She had been an English Puritan. She was baptized a Catholic. She learned to speak French. When she was 16, she had gone through puberty, so she had to get married, right? That's the way people prevented out-of-wedlock births. When a girl went through puberty, she got married. Well, she was 16, she needed to get married. There was a shortage of men. There was this 45-year-old widower, so she married him. So this guy's almost 30 years older than she is. They had an 18-year marriage, though, which produced 8 children, only 2 or 3 of which made it to adulthood, but still 8 children. And then in 1730, this first husband of hers died. He was in his mid-60s by then. And she married another man, this time a man 10 years younger, okay, to kind of make up, and with whom she would have another 6 children or so. And in 1730, right after her second marriage, one of her brothers, who had escaped the raid back in 1704, came up to Canada to rescue her. This is 26 years after her captivity began. He came up to Canada to rescue her, and she said, "Hey, my life is here. My life is here." My father would have been stunned to know that he had an English ancestor. My father, born in Canada, was convinced that he had nothing but French ancestors. Well, he had this English ancestor, Elizabeth, of course. And then finally, the last ancestor, and the second on my father's side, her name was Mitawa Megukwe. Mitawa Megukwe. She was an Indian. Mitawa Megukwe. She was born about 1631 in a little village north of the St. Lawrence River in what's now Quebec. She was an Algonquian, so the same large group that includes the Wampanoags down here. When she was about 15, she married an Indian man from a nearby village who was about 25, and they had a couple of kids. And then her village was attacked by their traditional enemies, the Iroquois. The Iroquois and the Algonquians didn't get along at all. And in this attack, her husband was killed, and her children were kidnapped, and she never saw either one again. And the leader of her village said, "Look, for safety, let's get next to the French." There was a new French city called Three Rivers, in French Trois-Rivières, it's on the St. Lawrence, halfway between Montreal and Quebec City. And that was a brand new French settlement. And the leader of her village said, "Let's move the village to be right next to Trois-Rivières. Then we'll be safe. Then we'll be safe. We have worked out a military arrangement with these French." And that's what happened. And I've been there. And what was the center of the Indian village was a 5-minute walk to the center of Trois-Rivières. I mean, these two settlements were right next to each other. And there, Mitawa Megukwe met a French soldier named Pierre Cook, C-O-U-C, not C-O-O-K, C-O-U-C, Pierre Cook, whose nickname was La Fleur, so he was Pierre Cook de La Fleur. And they got married, and with him she had another 6 children or so. She lived she died when she was in her mid-60s, so in the mid-1690s. And so because of her, she's one of their children was Madeleine Cook de La Fleur, who was my 7th great-grandmother. So that means Mitawa Megukwe is my 8th great-grandmother. So like Nancy, I'm part Indian, but a very small part. If you think of like one joint of one of my little fingers, and not the whole joint, maybe like half of that segment, that's how Indian I am, you know. So it's not enough for government recognition or casino founding or anything. What I notice in these stories is I don't see bad guys. I see a lot of people sometimes doing noble things, sometimes screwing up badly. I don't see bad guys. You have 2 groups of people with whom it seems to me tensions would be just inevitable. Think of the technological difference between the Indians and the European settlers. The Indians were living in the Stone Age, right? It's just a huge difference. The Indians had these vulnerable immune systems just because they had been isolated from the rest of the world for so long. They had different customs, different religions. There was lots of misunderstandings. There were lots of disrespect. There was some violence. Originally, at least around here, there were wise leaders on both sides. Massasoit was a wise leader, And William Bradford, the governor in Plymouth for a long, long time, was wise. But then later, I don't want to say Philip was unwise, but he was no match for his father, and tensions were much greater then. And his opposite number in Plymouth was John Winslow, who just doesn't impress me. I read about him. He was disrespectful toward the Indians. He was contemptuous to them. I haven't got a moral except to say what I said here. The relations between the settlers and the Indians were really complicated, and I'm just not comfortable with continuing to just repeat and repeat and repeat what you hear people say all the time, which was that we stole their land and we broke all this. Well, yes, the United States 200 years later did do these things, but I just think that the way we talk about the relationships between the Europeans and the Indians is oversimplified. And that's really all I have to offer. So now for the support of this congregation, the morning offering will be gratefully received, and I hope appreciated. And we should all do it. Donald turns off the camera. So he has to see you. I read it. The people online don't see you. Now is our time of sharing joys and concerns. The theory is that joy shared is multiplied and the concern or sorrow shared is divided. And
so I guess my joy is that the fundraising for the United Interfaith Action was finally over. And it was a moderate success. And I was surprised they had a bunch of politicians there. And so we did have some success in that regard, I guess. I also participated with the Coalition for Social Justice action meeting. It wasn't actually, it was a Zoom meeting, so if anybody's interested, they do meet on Zoom, which is a lot easier in a lot of ways. And I guess two of the issues that I participated with was the housing issue, which is suspending, is that the word? Suspending, the adjective for that, but you know, in other words, it's an impossible task that will never be accomplished. You roll the rock up the hill, and then it rolls on you at the end. But anyway, so that's the housing issue. Right? So, but the other one that was piqued my interest, is why I joined it, just to see what they were up to, was the bus service. So what they're actually trying to do is get some funding to make it a permanent free bus service for people in Sure, which I thought that was a heroic effort. Part of the millionaire's tax that we fought so hard for, that they gave half of it back, but that's another story. Was supposed to go for education and then transportation. And so one of the things that was pushed back then was that we could, allow people to expand our bus service, make it much more accessible to people at the lower incomes especially, because they are predominant users, and also make it much more comprehensive, so that they, you could go to church on Sundays. We used to have no buses on Sundays, and it's very difficult to get to point A to point B, especially in connections with other bus services in the surrounding area. So there was a push to try to expand that kind of stuff. So if anybody's interested in that, that was really cool. And finally, I just wanted to comment on this stuff with the arrowheads. It's so, I guess in some ways, I always thought of it as a curse my whole life. I've never lived anywhere more than like a year. I mean, literally my entire life, from the time I can remember, we were migrants, itinerants, right? I mean, everywhere around here. And there was a section of time where I lived on Lee's River. There used to be a boat market right across from the hotel there. Right? That was a boat market. And I lived up there for about a year, less than a year. But anyway, I used to do all my play with some of the kids in that neighborhood up by the power breaking point. And the construction, and I guess it was illegal. We used to go under fences and everything else. I mean, they probably have guard dogs now. But the amazing thing is when they built all of those pits, those cooling pits, they dug up all that land. We would find fossils and arrowheads and tools, and it was like, it was like, oh wow, I got another one, put it in your pocket, you show your friends. It was no big deal. And now it's like, wow, this is like, when I think about the fossils, these ferns and these pictures of fish, and, it's like, wow, I mean, so I guess I was gifted. So I guess I have to re-examine my curse, and maybe there's a lot of gifts in that.
Anyone else?
Good morning. Richard, I really enjoyed your presentation very much so. I was born and raised in the Midwest, and the Dakota lands were to the north, and the Pawnee were to the south. So we were the land that my family got when they came over here from Europe was sort of the war ground, the area where there was conflict. And it was really common for the farmers to turn up when they were plowing all of these artifacts. So it was an enlightening time for us. I have a lot of guilt actually around the fact that my ancestors in 1855 or 56 or so came across from Germany and took advantage of the land which belonged to the Pawnee and the Lakota and the Cherokee. There was a number of folks, Blackfeet were there. And they just really took that land and the government gave it to the railroad. The railroad sold portions of it off to the farmers so that they would have produce to send to market. But accustomed to that guilt, but when I got sober here, I was invited to join a group called the Red Road, which is a 12-step program. And it meets at the Dyton Community Church every Monday evening, and we do Zoom thing. But what really brought me to that particular form of recovery was that the word God for me, because of my childhood, was triggering. It would trigger panic attacks. And so I went to the 12-step program. I was invited by someone, and I really enjoyed the spirituality of the Native Americans. They were, of course, earth religions. It was a father, son, and mother moon, and so forth. And they were very well connected with the animal world, and we learned so many things from the wildlife and so forth on that. But The alcohol and drugs is just taking a terrible toll on Native Americans. And they developed this 12-step program based on what Bill Wilson and some of his other fellows did to develop the AA program. But they don't use the same language, you know. And it's enlightening for me because I can refer to God as a creator, which is very common usage with them. And it's been a real great experience to meet regularly with folks. And if anyone's interested, they hold meetings, gatherings, powwows, and so forth to preserve the culture the spiritual culture of the Native Americans. So thank you so much for that. Thank you.
And of course, I have one thing that I have a very big joy about is this program, Laundry Love. It is to help the homeless with their laundry. But my son, 20 years old, on Mother's Day this year, John Milky is the one who's brought the voice up and helping this thing with laundry. So he has a voice, and he's in the community. He's out there, Laundry Love, looking for donations and support in any which way to help them keep that program going. And then today, like I say, I'm proud of my son, 20 years old. Wow.
Let's join our closing hymn, number 134, Our World is One World.
What touches one affects us all. The seas that wash us round about, the clouds that cover us, the rains that fall. Our world is one world. The thoughts we think affect us all. The way we build our attitudes with love or hate we make a bridge or wall. Our world is one world. Its ways of wealth affect us all. The way we spend, the way we share, who are the rich or poor, who stand or fall. Our world is one world, just like a ship that bears us all. Fear and greed make many woes, but where our hearts can hear a different call.
May ours be a religion that, like sunshine, goes everywhere. Its temple, all space. Its shrine, the good heart. Its creed, all truth. Its ritual, works of love. Amen.